The dashboard camera captured everything in stark digital clarity. The flashing red and blue lights painting the pre-dawn darkness, the nervous energy of a rookie officer's first solo traffic stop, and the moment when assumption collided with reality on a quiet stretch of Highway 92. Officer Jake Morrison had been on the force for exactly 47 days when he spotted the black sedan moving through the early morning traffic at 6:23 a.m. The vehicle appeared to be traveling 15 miles over the posted limit, weaving slightly between lanes as it navigated the sparse weekend traffic. Morrison's training echoed in his mind: erratic driving patterns, excessive speed, potential impairment. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio as he accelerated to close the distance. What Morrison couldn't see from his patrol car was the man behind the wheel, Colonel David Washington, a 23-year veteran of the United States Army. Returning from an emergency call about his elderly mother's hospitalization 3 counties over. The colonel's broad frame filled his black t-shirt as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind consumed with worry about the woman who had raised him alone after his father died in Vietnam. He had driven through the night, surviving on gas station, coffee, and determination, completely unaware that his fatigue-induced lane corrections had caught the attention of law enforcement. Morrison activated his emergency lights and pulled behind the sedan. Standard procedure dictated a cautious approach, but the rookie's adrenaline surged as he noticed the driver's size through the rear window. The academy instructors had drilled into him the importance of controlling every interaction, of establishing dominance before a situation could escalate. At 24 years old, Morrison had grown up in the suburbs of the same county he now patrolled, where his understanding of military bearing and discipline came primarily from action movies and basic training videos. The colonel pulled over immediately, his muscle memory from decades of military protocol guiding his actions. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, turned off the engine, and waited. His military identification sat in his wallet alongside his driver's license, both documents that told the story of a man who had served his country with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan, who had earned the respect of soldiers under his command, and who now oversaw training protocols at the regional military base. Morrison approached the vehicle with his hand resting on his service weapon, a habit that had become second nature during his brief tenure. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and distant farmland, but the rookie officer's focus remained fixed on the imposing figure in the driver's seat. License and registration, Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the practiced authority he had been taught to project. He noted the driver's civilian clothes, the way the man's shoulders seemed to fill the entire window frame, and what he interpreted as a defiant slowness in the driver's movements. Colonel Washington reached slowly toward his glove compartment, announcing each movement as protocol demanded. "I'm reaching for my registration, officer." His voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations, but Morrison interpreted the calm tone as potential resistance. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Morrison snapped, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle." The colonel complied without argument, unfolding his considerable frame from the sedan. At 6 feet 3 inches and weighing over 250 pounds, Washington's presence seemed to dwarf the younger officer. Morrison took an involuntary step backward, his training screaming warnings about size disparities and the potential for physical confrontation. "Is there a problem, officer?" Washington asked, his hands visible at his sides. Years of military discipline had taught him to de-escalate situations through calm professionalism, but he could see the tension in the young officer's stance, the way Morrison's eyes darted nervously between his face and his hands. "You were speeding and driving erratically," Morrison replied, his voice rising slightly. "Have you been drinking tonight?" "No, sir. I was driving to the hospital. My mother—" "I'll ask the questions," Morrison interrupted, his authority challenged by what he perceived as the driver's commanding presence. In the growing daylight, he could see more details: the man's confident posture, the way he seemed completely at ease despite the traffic stop, the subtle air of authority that surrounded him like an invisible uniform. The colonel's military identification remained in his wallet, unknown to the officer who was now running his civilian driver's license through the patrol car's computer system. The database would show a clean record, no outstanding warrants, no history of violence or criminal activity. But it wouldn't show the medals, the commendations, or the hundreds of young soldiers who had served under Washington's command and learned from his example of honor and integrity. Morrison returned from his patrol car with a citation book, his confidence growing as he prepared to assert control over the situation. The computer check had revealed nothing alarming, but the rookie officer had already committed to his course of action. In his mind, this was a routine traffic stop with a non-compliant driver who needed to understand the consequences of challenging law enforcement authority. "I'm citing you for excessive speed and reckless driving," Morrison announced, beginning to write the ticket. "You need to learn that there are consequences for your actions." Colonel Washington watched the young officer's movements with growing concern. Something about Morrison's demeanor, the barely controlled aggression in his voice, the way he seemed to be performing rather than simply doing his job, triggered the colonel's protective instincts. He had seen young soldiers make similar mistakes under pressure, letting ego override judgment, and he recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. "Officer, I think there might be some confusion," Washington began, reaching slowly toward his back pocket where his military identification waited. "Don't move," Morrison shouted, his hand flying to his weapon. "Keep your hands visible." The morning traffic had begun to increase, with several vehicles slowing as they passed the scene. A few drivers pulled out cell phones, sensing that something was developing beyond a routine traffic stop. The dashboard camera continued recording, capturing every word, every gesture, every escalating moment of tension between the rookie officer and the man whose true identity remained hidden in his wallet. Colonel Washington raised his hands, his military training warring with his growing frustration. He had commanded respect from generals and enlisted personnel alike, had made life-and-death decisions in combat zones, had earned his position through decades of service and sacrifice. Yet here he stood on an American highway, being treated like a common criminal by someone young enough to be his son. "I need you to calm down, officer," Washington said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "Let me show you I'm giving the orders here." Morrison's voice cracked with strain as he felt his control of the situation slipping away. The driver's composure, his obvious lack of fear, the way he seemed to be trying to take charge of the interaction, it all fed into Morrison's growing panic. The citation book trembled in Morrison's hands as he completed the paperwork, his training battling against instincts that told him this was no ordinary traffic stop. The man before him radiated an authority that seemed to challenge everything Morrison had been taught about: maintaining control, about commanding respect, about the natural order of power on America's highways. As Morrison prepared to hand over the citation, neither man could have predicted that the next few minutes would transform a routine traffic stop into a career-defining moment that would expose the dangerous gap between assumption and reality, between the authority of a badge and the deeper authority earned through service, sacrifice, and honor. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the highway as two worlds prepared to collide with consequences that neither the rookie officer nor the decorated colonel could have imagined. The tension on Highway 92 reached its breaking point as Officer Morrison extended the citation toward Colonel Washington, his hand trembling slightly with the adrenaline that had been building since the traffic stop began. What happened next would be replayed countless times in internal affairs meetings, news broadcasts, and social media posts that would reshape both men's lives forever. "Sir, I need to see your identification," Washington said firmly, his patience finally wearing thin. "Military identification." Morrison's face flushed with irritation. "You don't give me orders. I've already seen your license." "Officer Morrison," Washington interrupted, his voice now carrying the full weight of command authority that had been forged in combat zones and refined through decades of leadership. "I am Colonel David Washington, United States Army. I am showing you my military identification now." The rookie officer's world tilted as Washington slowly withdrew his military ID, the morning sunlight catching the official seal and photograph. That told a story Morrison was wholly unprepared to hear. The name, rank, and service record were clearly visible on the card that Washington held steady in front of him. Morrison's eyes darted between the identification and Washington's face, his mind struggling to process the reality that was crashing down around him. The man he had been treating as a potential criminal was not only a decorated military officer, but held a rank that commanded respect from generals and politicians alike. This, this can't be right, Morrison stammered, his authority evaporating like morning mist. The citation book fell from his nerveless fingers, scattering across the asphalt as passing motorists continued to slow down and record the unfolding drama. Colonel Washington's expression remained controlled, but his eyes held the disappointment of a man who had served his country with distinction only to be humiliated on a highway by someone sworn to protect and serve. Officer, I was driving to Regional Medical Center. My mother suffered a stroke last night. I received the call at 0400 hours and have been driving since then. The weight of Morrison's mistake began to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Every protocol he had violated, every assumption he had made, every moment of escalation came flooding back with crystalline clarity. The dashboard camera had recorded it all: his aggressive approach, his failure to listen, his determination to dominate rather than serve. Sir, I didn't know, Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the highway traffic. I was just doing my job. Your job, Washington replied, his tone measured but cutting, is to serve and protect, not to intimidate and assume. He pocketed his military identification and retrieved his driver's license from Morrison's slack grip. I have dedicated my life to defending this country and training young men and women to do the same. I have served in 2 combat deployments, commanded over 300 soldiers, and earned the respect of my peers through honor and integrity. Morrison's radio crackled to life, his dispatcher's voice cutting through the morning air with routine efficiency. Unit 47, what's your status on the traffic stop? The rookie officer stared at his radio, paralyzed by the magnitude of his situation. How could he explain that he had just conducted an aggressive traffic stop on a decorated military colonel? How could he justify his behavior to his supervisors, to the media, to the growing crowd of witnesses who had captured everything on their phones? Colonel Washington observed Morrison's internal collapse with the same clinical assessment he had once applied to soldiers under extreme stress. The young officer was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown, the kind that occurred when reality shattered carefully constructed beliefs about power, authority, and control. Unit 47, please respond. The dispatcher's voice came again, more insistent this time. Washington reached toward Morrison's radio, his movement causing the rookie to flinch reflexively. May I? The colonel asked, his tone professional but firm. Morrison nodded mutely, unable to form words as Washington keyed the radio with practiced efficiency. Dispatch, this is Colonel David Washington, United States Army. I am currently involved in a traffic stop with Unit 47 on Highway 92. Please contact Lieutenant Henderson and have him respond to this location immediately. The radio fell silent for several seconds before the dispatcher's voice returned, noticeably more formal. Copy that, Colonel Washington. Lieutenant Henderson is en route. ETA 15 minutes. Morrison's career flashed before his eyes as the reality of his situation crystallized. In less than 20 minutes, his commanding officer would arrive to find him frozen beside a decorated military colonel whom he had treated with suspicion and disrespect. The dashboard camera footage would be reviewed, witnesses would be interviewed, and his 47-day career would likely come to an abrupt and humiliating end. Sir, Morrison finally managed to speak, his voice cracking with emotion. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I was just trying to do the right thing. Colonel Washington studied the young officer with the same attention he had once given to frightened recruits facing their first combat mission. He saw fear, shame, and the dawning recognition of consequences that could reshape a life forever. Officer Morrison, Washington said quietly, the right thing would have been to listen. The right thing would have been to treat me with the same respect you would want for yourself or your family. The right thing would have been to remember that the badge you wear is meant to protect citizens, not intimidate them. The approaching sound of sirens announced Lieutenant Henderson's arrival, followed by 2 additional patrol cars whose officers had been monitoring the radio traffic. Morrison watched helplessly as his supervisor emerged from his vehicle, his expression grim as he took in the scene. The scattered citation papers, the rookie officer's obvious distress, and the imposing figure of Colonel Washington standing calmly beside his vehicle. Colonel Washington, Lieutenant Henderson said, extending his hand respectfully. I apologize for whatever has occurred here. We'll get this sorted out immediately. Lieutenant, Washington replied, accepting the handshake. Your officer conducted a traffic stop that escalated unnecessarily. I was traveling to the hospital to see my mother, who suffered a stroke last night. I have been cooperative throughout this encounter. But Officer Morrison seemed determined to treat me as a threat rather than a citizen he had sworn to protect. Henderson's face darkened as he absorbed the colonel's words and observed Morrison's obvious guilt. The lieutenant had served in the military himself before joining law enforcement, and he understood the gravity of disrespecting a field grade officer who had dedicated his life to serving his country. Morrison, Henderson said sharply, return to your vehicle and wait for me there. As the rookie officer walked away with his shoulders slumped in defeat, Colonel Washington addressed the lieutenant directly. I don't want to destroy that young man's career, but he needs to understand that the power you've given him comes with responsibility. He treated me like a criminal from the moment he approached my vehicle, and that's not acceptable. Lieutenant Henderson nodded grimly. Colonel, I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated. Officer Morrison will face appropriate disciplinary action and will be reviewing his training protocols immediately. The morning sun had fully risen by the time Colonel Washington finally arrived at Regional Medical Center, where his mother lay recovering from her stroke. The traffic stop that should have taken 10 minutes had stretched into an hour-long ordeal that would generate headlines, internal investigations, and soul-searching discussions about police training and community relations. Officer Jake Morrison sat in his patrol car, watching as his career crumbled around him like autumn leaves. The dashboard camera that had faithfully recorded his every mistake would soon become evidence in his own disciplinary hearing, a permanent record of the moment when his assumptions about authority and respect collided with the reality of service and honor. Colonel Washington's mother recovered from her stroke, but the colonel's faith in the community he had sworn to protect had been shaken by a rookie officer's inability to see beyond the color of his skin and the civilian clothes he wore. The military leader who had commanded respect in war zones around the world had been forced to prove his worth on an American highway to someone young enough to be his son. The case became a textbook example of what happens when assumption meets reality, when inexperience confronts experience, and when the true meaning of service and respect is tested in the harsh light of a dashboard camera and the unforgiving lens of public scrutiny that in the end. Officer Morrison's traffic stop had indeed backfired, not because he had pulled over the wrong person, but because he had forgotten that respect is earned through service, not demanded through authority, and that the uniform he wore was meant to honor those who serve, not intimidate those who have already served with distinction.